You are listening or watching to Can You Believe with Brad Pomerance. I'm glad you're joining us today. You may have seen me on Jewish Life Television, hosting Air, Land, and Sea or Generations. But yes, now I'm doing podcasting and having a lot of fun with it. And can you believe, as we say, that anti-Semitism is an American tradition? Well, I was a little taken aback when I saw that book title, and here it is, Anti-Semitism, an American Tradition, and I didn't know how I felt about it, but I do now after reading the book, and we are talking to its author. Her name is Pamela Nadell. She's a professor at American University. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Nadell. You know, the title is so powerful and somewhat provocative. And I want to get a sense, in the simplest sense, how did you come up with that title?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And the title is actually a nod to the historian Tony Michaels, who more than a decade ago wrote a very important article about the persistence of American anti-Semitism, which a lot of his colleagues pushed back on because we didn't think it was such a big deal back then. And at the end of the article—
when was this? When was the article?
Probably 2010, maybe. Okay. I'd have to check the date.
Fairly, 15, 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the article, he talked about the diversity of traditions that we have in the United States. And actually, we're living through some of those way beyond the Jewish community at the moment. So traditions celebrating the right in terms of politics, traditions celebrating the left in terms of politics. And that stuck with me. And that's how I came up with the title. But I also want to point to something that those of us who are very careful writers think about, and that it's anti-Semitism, an American tradition, because had it been a colon, it would have made an American tradition a subtitle, and subtitles get lost.
Fascinating. As a grammarian or someone who pretends to be a grammarian, I get what you're saying. It's complex, it's complicated. And I will tell you this, before October 7th, maybe before Charlottesville, I would have disagreed. I would have said, like many of those that you referenced, that yes, America has faced anti-Semitism in kind of fits and starts, but it's the 21st century. And so it is not an American tradition anymore. But sadly, we know it is, and it persists. And before we talk about the 21st century, I want to go back to, the 17th century and take us through what your book did so darn effectively. And I'll show you, I'm that guy who highlighted the book. Once a college student, always a college student. And I want to go back to 1654. For those of us that follow Jewish history, that is a pivotal moment in the Jewish experience in America. Obviously, we know that Jews had had difficult times in Europe. They were being expelled from England and France and just all over the place. But what happened in 1654 in what was then called New Amsterdam?
What happened actually begins in what was then called the Dutch New World or the Portuguese New World, and referring specifically to Brazil. And when Brazil was being colonized earlier in the 17th century by the Portuguese, Jews couldn't go there because Portugal had expelled its Jews or forced them to convert in 1497. But then this is part of these colonial wars, and the Dutch take it over. And Jews who had been living in Amsterdam, which was a place that had actually agreed to tolerate Jewish settlement back in the 17th century, that Jews had migrated there in astonishingly large numbers. There were synagogues, there were charities, there was a substantial Jewish community.
I mean, the very first synagogue in the entire Western Hemisphere is in Pernambuco, Recife, and this was started by these formerly Sephardic, Dutch, Brazilian Jews that you reference.
And what happened then is there's a long colonial war. the Portuguese reassert their hegemony over their colony. They kick out the Dutch. They're very generous. They tell the Jews who have lived there that they have 3 months to get
Right.
out of the
Very
country.
generous.
And most of them go, they're poor, they've survived a terrible war. Most of them return to Amsterdam, where the Amsterdam Jewish community, the established Jewish community, has to deal with them. But 23 set off for New Amsterdam. And when they land there, after a series of really difficulties on their voyage, they land there. We know that Governor Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, which of course later will become Manhattan, Peter Stuyvesant writes a letter saying he wants to get rid of this deceitful race, such hateful enemies.
Deceitful race.
That's his words. Deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And he can't do that on his own because the owners of the colony, that they're part of a company in Amsterdam. So he has to ask for permission to expel the Jews. By the time he receives his answer, it's after the winter. They land probably early September of 1654. He receives an answer in the spring. It takes a while for letters to go back and forth. And he's told that he has to permit them to stay, to live and trade just as Jews do in Amsterdam. He still tries to make their lives very difficult, but he doesn't manage to get rid of them.
That moment, in so many ways for me, is almost a metaphor for what Jews have faced really since then. It's kind of like, I love you, don't touch me. It's, we want you to benefit our society, but yet don't get too close. Don't touch me. And so we kind of see that theme, like, you can stay, but we're not going to make it so pleasant for you.
I see it more as very traditional Christian anti-Judaism because we don't have anti-Semitism yet. As you know from having read the book, the word's not coined until the 1870s.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. But what we do have is we have traditional anti-Judaism. And so he calls the Jews blasphemers of the name of Christ. He talks about them as usurers, which of course is the medieval stereotype of Jews as moneylenders, which many of them were because they couldn't do anything else economically.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask you. I don't think many people realize the reason why Jews were called, usurious and Shylocks is because in Christian Europe, they weren't allowed to own land or engage in most professions. They were only allowed to be money lenders. So this was the profession imposed on them, and yet it was used against them.
Right, of course. And this is long before, by the time Stuyvesant does this, Shylock has already been invented.
Right.
In Shakespearean England. But this is an old stereotype about Jews. And we know that when Jews were invited to settle, for example, when they were invited by, kings and princes and dukes to settle in towns, they were given charters that actually listed most of the protections they would have from money lending because it was a dangerous occupation.
So we know that as the Americas went through this colonial period, that many of the colonies engaged in their own version of anti-Jewish laws, be it, making it a capital crime to deny Jesus was the Son of God in Maryland, or, be it that Virginia, pressured Jews to somehow convert, or whatever it was. But yet, when America became a nation, we to this day refer to a moment that is really a sense of pride. And that is, where I'm going, and that is George Washington's most famous letter to the Thoreau Synagogue. What was that letter, and why is that letter to this day so revered?
it's so revered. And by the way, Washington received letters of congratulations from many different religious groups, including others from other Jewish congregations. But he was responding, as you're referencing, in 1789 to a letter that he had received that probably was actually read out loud to him when he went to Rhode Island. Washington when he became president, after the Constitution's ratified, he took a tour of various states, and Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution. So this is the last stop on his trip. And there was a kind of formal presentation where members of various communities read out loud letters. And because what we now call the Touro Synagogue, but then was called the Hebrew Congregation of Newport, this is in Newport, Rhode Island, that congregation, its leader, who was a lay leader, read out loud to him a letter. And Washington goes back to New York or Philadelphia, I can't remember which, and goes back and he writes a response which quotes very much from the letter that Moses Seixas wrote to him. And it says that this is a nation which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And he specifically says it is, and he's talking to Jews, but he's really talking more broadly. It is now no more that we will speak of toleration. In other places at this time in Western Europe, Jews were being tolerated. They were allowed to live the way they were allowed to live in Amsterdam, but they were not seen as full members of society. And it is the most famous of all his letters. It's very interesting to see them. There was a wonderful exhibit at the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History a number of years ago, where they showed the Washington Newport letter alongside all the other letters he had written.
Yeah, I saw it. I saw it. Yeah. Now, during this era, this kind of pre or post-Revolutionary War era, the Jewish community was tiny. And Newport actually had one of the largest Jewish communities, I learned from your book and otherwise, including New York, including Charleston, Savannah, Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia and New York may have larger communities today. The other ones, not so much. But the Jewish community of the early American experience was much different than it is today. But yet, we still heard in this pre-Civil War era these concepts of Jews as menacing, as using money as a way to somehow get ahead. You know, how is it and why is it that when there are so few Jews in the country, I mean, we're talking like, 3,000, maybe in 1820, there was, 4,000, 1830, maybe 15,000, not even 1%, not even 0.5%, that these kind of canards are still out there, or not even still, but are out there to even begin.
They're out there because they're such a deep part of Western Christendom. And the way I put it in the book is that the immigrants who came from Europe and came to the United States, that they carried these traditions about Jews in their knapsacks. This is part of their cultural baggage. And how did they want to solve the Jewish problem back then? They wanted the Jews to convert. If Jews converted, that was the solution. So what did they do in the 18 teens? They established missionary societies to convert the Jews. What else did they do in the 18 teens? One of the most popular authors of that day, he writes a whole cycle of books that are based on biblical narratives, and he dedicates it to the women of Israel and the various volumes to the women, to the men of Israel, in the hopes that they will see the true Christ.
There's no doubt that this desire to convert, which apparently began, like you said, in the 18 teens, has continued throughout the centuries here in America. It seems to me, after reading your book, that the 1840s was a moment, and even into the 1850s, where Jews found their voice and decided to stand up. And I point to the Damascus Affair as well as the Montaro Affair. Could you give us a sense of what those were? Candidly, I thought I knew a lot about kind of Jewish history. I barely heard about the Montaro Affair, and I wasn't so familiar with the Damascus Affair.
Mhm. The Damascus Affair is a classic blood libel. In 1840, in Damascus in Syria, there a Capuchin friar and his Muslim assistant, they go out, they go into the Jewish neighborhood, they're going to raise some funds for a poor family, and they disappear. And what happens is immediately the suspicion falls upon the Jews because it's getting close to Passover, and there's the assumption that Jews need Christian blood to celebrate their rituals. As a
And
result,
let's remind our viewers and listeners, that is a blood libel that dates back to the beginning of the last millennia. Was it 11th or 12th century?
right.
Yeah.
The first blood libel was in 1144 in Norwich, England, and then it gets caught up with the notion, especially of it's essentially the Jews are reenacting the crucifixion. They're murdering a child instead of murdering Jesus. And blood libels are notorious in terms of the longevity and the explosiveness of them, and they appeared all across Europe and obviously into the Middle East as well. And you are right that as a result of that affair, Jews, first in Europe and then in the United States, begin to find a collective voice and to stand up and develop what I actually call a playbook of how to respond. They denounce the canard. They assume that only in sort of the Oriental Middle East would they still believe this. They denounce the torture that they used on the Jews to extract confessions. And they cry out to the federal government. They appeal to the President of the United States, to the Secretary of State, that to intercede to protect their brethren around the world.
And they do that again in
And they
1858
and they do it again in
with
1958 with the
and this
Montaro.
story is crazy. I mean, to use a simple word, this is really quite an event. What happened with this young boy?
In some ways, I'm so surprised you weren't familiar with it.
I mean, I was, but not it's not as well known as you would think, is what I would say.
I think it's probably better known than the Damascus Affair, but
it is,
especially because David Kurtzer wrote a great book, and there's actually an Italian film about it.
Yeah.
But it is a crazy story because what happens is this takes place in Italy, where a young child who it had been in the care of his Christian nursemaid, that he became ill, and she, on her own, without resorting to a priest, baptized the child, fearing that he would die and he would go to hell. And at some point, she confessed this to her priest, and this is in Bologna. And when the priest finds out, he takes the news to the Inquisition, which still exists, 1858, still exists in Italy, and the Inquisition cannot let a Jewish child remain with his family.
Oh.
So they come in and they kidnap him. It's called the
literally.
Kidnapping.
They literally kidnap the child.
They take him, they grab him from his parents, and they take him to Rome, to where he is raised in what's called the House of the Catechumens, which was where Jews were taken if they wanted to convert, or if they were so poor they were forced to convert, or if it was a woman that her husband was converting. And he's raised there, and he's raised under the protection of the Pope. And he actually becomes a priest. But it was a story that made a huge impression on Jews around the world. It actually ultimately leads to the downfall of the Papal States. But Jews in America know about it. And there's a man who's dying in a Catholic hospital, a soldier, and he begs the man in the bed next to him, if I die, to make sure that I have a Jewish funeral. And the Jewish community in, I think it's St. Louis, I could be wrong, but the Jewish community has to fight against the hospital to get the body for a Jewish burial.
During this period, irony of ironies, in the United States Senate in the 1850s, are two Jews appointed by their states to be members of the U.S. Senate. One from Louisiana, one from Florida, Judah Benjamin and David Levy-Yulee. So it's pretty remarkable that while there's maybe a discomfort with the Jewish community, state legislatures yet are still willing to put Jews in the Senate. What do you make of that?
What I make of that is that anti-Semitism as an American tradition is almost a counterpoint to the much larger story, and the story that we historians mostly wrote about Jewish entrance into American life, about Jewish success, about the rise of Jewish communities, about Jews entering politics, about Jews' contributions to the American economy, about Jews' contributions to intellectual life and to American popular culture. And I think that's really important to understand. Recently, a few colleagues said to me that they thought I wrote a new history of the American Jewish experience, but I'm writing a counterpoint to the large narratives that so many of us and many of my colleagues wrote.
I so appreciate you saying that, because I have said there is no question, at least in my mind, and you may agree based on what you just said, that in the history of the world, literally the world, there has been no country that has been more welcoming, more hospitable to Jews than the United States of America. That doesn't take away that anti-Semitism is an American tradition. It's just a dichotomy. It's that simple. It's the dichotomy that we live.
Right. It's the dichotomy, and it's also that we hadn't paid attention to the anti-Semitism part until it was back in our faces with Charlottesville and especially Tree of Life. Because this is not a post-October 7th book. I'm a historian. I only worked on this book for 6 years. That's not a long time for historians. But this book came out of my own sense that as a historian, I had missed the story of what happened that allowed the murders at Tree of Life on October 27th, 2018.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because for me, Charlottesville and Tree of Life were horrendous, but it was really post-October 7th where I have come to the conclusion that anti-Semitism is an American tradition. I don't know that I would have come to that conclusion before that. We'll talk about that soon, I promise. I want to talk about the Civil War. In 1860, let's say, maybe 150,000 Jews in America, 0.5%. There was some fomenting of anti-Jewish rhetoric during that Civil War period. But I think a pivotal moment in the history of the Jewish experience in the United States has to be General Order Number 11, an order that I guess a lot of people don't know about, but it is so important to know. What is General Order Number 11?
General Orders Number 11, believe it or not, even though it's only one, it had the S at the end. General
is that right? Okay, thank you.
That wasn't a typo on my part. General Orders Number 11 was an order issued in December of 1862 by General Ulysses S. Grant.
Future president. Ulysses. Yeah.
Right. Future president. And Grant was at that point in charge of a district, which was called the Tennessee District, but actually ran from the southern tip of Illinois down to the Gulf of Mexico. And Grant decided that he was deeply disturbed by smuggling that was going on in his district, that he felt was aiding the Confederate cause. And he issued an edict expelling the Jews and giving them 24 hours to get out of his entire military district.
So let me ask you before we continue. There probably was smuggling going on, I would guess. There probably was profiteering going on, I would guess. But why, in that moment, did General Grant and others decide, oh, it's the Jews that are doing it? I mean, when the country's 0.5% Jewish.
Right. my guess is that there were Jews who were involved in the smuggling, but by
Maybe.
no means could they have been the majority of the
Right.
people engaged in the smuggling. But you have that old stereotype of the Jews as being usurers, as being even in Stuyvesant's letter, he says that they traded unfairly with Christians. They were unfair competitors. And so we have this motif of the Jews as being nefarious in virtually everything they do: religion, economics. Ultimately, we'll get to, social and popular life. But he by expelling them as a class, that's his words, as a class, he kicked all the Jews out, blamed everyone for the misdeeds of a few. So what happens ultimately is that an immigrant from Prussia named Caesar Kaskel sees this, and he's infuriated. He's only been in America for a few years, and he goes from Paducah, Kentucky, to the White House. Literally, in those days, you could get a meeting with the
Right.
President of the United
Oh,
States
yeah.
through your
Oh, yeah.
congressperson. It goes to the White House, and Lincoln countermands the offer immediately. And
So that's pretty
ultimately,
remarkable. Think
it
about that,
is.
though.
It's
18 days
completely
later, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who was probably, I don't know, neutral on Jews. We don't know anything much about him in terms of his views of Jews. It's shocking.
Yeah. Well, Lincoln, actually, we do know quite a bit about Lincoln and the
Well,
Jews,
to
because
tell.
Jonathan Sarna wrote a great book on it.
I
But
forgot. You're right. You're right.
yeah,
Lincoln and the Jews. I read it.
Lincoln had a
How
lot
could I?
of
Yeah.
contacts with Jews because of coming out of Illinois, where there was a significant Jewish community, and he actually did know quite a bit about Jews. But Lincoln, I don't think, countermanded the order because of that. He countermanded the order because, in terms of the American tradition, you don't blame an entire class of people for the misdeeds of a few. And in fact, when one of Lincoln's other generals conveyed the message to Grant that the order had been countermanded, he said that you can't blame an entire class of people. And Grant ultimately, as he runs for president, becomes president, really appoints more Jews than ever to political office, to the civil service, and really tries to make up for that terrible mistake.
What's interesting is that Grant was a Republican. And of course, the parties were different back then, Republicans and Democrats. But, historically, Jews have been Democrats. And I'm just wondering, can we trace that Democratic preference amongst Jewish Americans all the way back to that moment?
I'm not positive we can trace that back to that moment, because when I think of remember, Lincoln is the first Republican
He
presidential
is.
candidate coming out of the new Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of the Democratic Party from that era, the Democratic Party from that era is really the Southern Democrats who are opposing Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jewish embrace of the Democratic Party really, and I'm guessing because this is not my area of expertise, but I think it really comes when millions, 2.5 million East European Jews come into America, and the Democratic Party is the party that is, more in line with
Right.
upholding immigration and giving them rights. But that's a big shift,
Yeah.
late 19th, early 20th century.
Sure. I had a feeling this episode would turn into a two-parter, which it is, and I appreciate your decision to stick with us. I would just conclude before we continue our conversation and talk about the 20th century. One of the other canards that came out of the Civil War is that Jews did not fight for the Union and the Confederacy, when we know that's not true. How do we know that's not true?
We know that it's not true because when that canard was put out in the late 1880s or 1890s, that Jewish communal leader of that day, who was very well known, very important, but nobody today would remember, a man named Simon Wolf, began to gather the names of all of the Jews who had served in both armies and compiled an extraordinary list, which he then published to show that Jews had done their military service.
Yes, at that time, I understand that he found at least 8,000 that had fought for either the Union or the Confederacy. And a book came out recently by Adam Mendelsohn, which actually increased that number to, I think, about 10,000. So,
Right.
from what,
And
yeah, please.
Adam, that was Adam's book on the Union. He hasn't even done the book on the Confederacy
Right.
yet.
And as I understand it, it appears that Jews joined the military either through draft or otherwise at about their percentage of population, maybe a little more.
Mm-hmm.
So Jews were absolutely patriots, I guess you could say, on both sides. Okay, Professor, when we come back to our next episode, what I want to do is I want to talk about the term anti-Semitism, how that started, where that came from, and then talk about anti-Semitism, Jew hatred in the 20th and the 21st century. I am so glad that you have joined us on Can You Believe? We're going to have a whole other episode with the professor from American University. Her name is Pamela Nadell, and she is the author of this book, Anti-Semitism, an American Tradition. Please stick with us for episode 2 with Professor Pamela Nadell.
Thank you.